The airport lounge manager sneered and told the old man to wait outside in the rain, just because his leg was metal and his German shepherd stood too close. A young employee whispered that he looked unstable. Security threatened to take the dog away, and travelers turned their heads as the veteran struggled to stand on his prosthetic. They mocked his silence, questioned if he could afford to be there, and treated him like he didn't belong. What none of them knew was that the quiet man gripping his phone was a decorated Navy SEAL who had once walked out of hell carrying others on his back. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. And if this story touches your heart, please subscribe to Angels in Uniform for more stories of faith, courage, and justice. The rain was not gentle. It did not fall like a whisper or a passing inconvenience. It came down heavy and cold, striking the concrete outside the luxury airport lounge with a dull, relentless rhythm, as if the sky itself were knocking on a door that refused to open. Beneath the glow of warm, amber lights behind thick glass doors, an old man stood alone, his dark navy jacket soaked through, water seeping into the fabric and clinging to his skin. He did not step back from the rain. He simply stood there, straight-backed out of habit rather than comfort, his weight shifting carefully from one leg to the other. The left leg was not like the right. From below the knee, it was a prosthetic, matte metal and carbon fiber hidden beneath dark khaki fabric. Years of practice had taught him how to balance, how to stand without drawing attention. But the rain made it harder. The ground was slick. The prosthetic felt heavier than usual, colder, less forgiving. Each minute forced a small, involuntary adjustment, a quiet negotiation between pain and pride. His hands, weathered and veined, trembled just enough to betray the effort. At his left side stood Ranger, a large German shepherd with a black and tan coat darkened by rain. Ranger was no young dog. His muzzle carried the faintest dusting of gray, and a thin scar curled along the edge of one ear, a relic of a past that had never fully let either of them go. He stood close enough that his shoulder brushed the man's thigh whenever the man shifted. Ranger's posture was alert but restrained, ears angled forward, eyes moving constantly between the glass doors and the people passing behind them. He did not bark. He did not growl. He simply watched, steady and protective, like a sentry who understood his post without being told. Inside the lounge, laughter drifted through the glass, muffled but unmistakable. The scent of coffee and polished leather seemed to linger just out of reach. People moved freely inside, coats dry, shoes clean, their reflections sliding past the glass without a second glance at the man outside until the door opened. Martin Hale stepped out with practiced irritation. He was a man in his late 40s, tall, clean-shaven, his salt and pepper hair carefully styled as if disorder were a personal insult. His tailored suit was charcoal gray, unwrinkled, and his shoes gleamed even under the dull airport lighting. Years in hospitality management had given him a voice that sounded polite even when it was not. His eyes, however, carried something colder, an assessment sharpened by habit and reinforced by authority. "Sir," Martin said, loud enough for those nearby to hear, "I've already explained this. This area is not for people like you." The words landed with precision, not shouted, not whispered, public. The old man looked up slowly. His face was deeply lined, not from bitterness, but from time. Silver gray hair was cut short in a style he had never stopped wearing, and light stubble shadowed his jaw, accentuating cheekbones worn sharp by age and endurance. His eyes were calm, too calm perhaps, the kind of calm forged by long familiarity with far worse moments than this. He did not argue. He did not ask for clarification. "You're making other guests uncomfortable," Martin continued, gesturing vaguely toward the glass. "I need you to leave the area immediately." Ranger shifted his weight, stepping half a pace forward before stopping himself. His body remained between the man and Martin, subtle but unmistakable. "And the dog," Martin added, his gaze dropping to Ranger with open disapproval. "Animals aren't permitted here. If you don't move along, I'll have no choice but to call security or animal control." A ripple of attention moved through the small crowd nearby. A woman in a beige coat glanced over and quickly looked away. A man in a business jacket paused, frowned, and continued walking as if nothing unusual were happening. Silence settled. Not empty silence, but the kind filled with avoidance. A younger employee stood a few steps behind Martin, her badge reading Sarah Kim. She couldn't have been more than 24. Slender, with dark hair pulled into a tight ponytail that emphasized the tiredness in her eyes. Her uniform was immaculate, but her hands were clasped together as if she were holding herself back from saying something she knew she shouldn't. Her gaze flicked from the old man's face to the prosthetic leg, then quickly away. "He doesn't look well," Sarah murmured, not quite under her breath. "Sir, he might need to sit." Martin didn't turn. "This is procedure," he replied curtly. "We don't make exceptions." The old man inhaled slowly, then spoke for the first time. His voice was rough but controlled, worn down by years of disuse rather than weakness. "I can't stand very long." It was not a plea. It was a fact. Martin's expression didn't change. "I'm sorry, sir. Procedures don't allow for exceptions." The word procedures settled between them like a locked door. Rain ran down the old man's collar and into his sleeves. His left knee ached sharply, the prosthetic grinding ever so slightly as he adjusted again. Ranger leaned closer, his flank pressing firmly against the man's leg, offering silent support. For a moment, just a moment, the man's composure wavered. His fingers tightened in Ranger's fur, grounding himself in the familiar warmth. Then something strange happened. Ranger's ears twitched sharply, and he lifted his head, staring not at Martin, but past him, toward the glass doors. His body stiffened, tail still, eyes fixed as if he had sensed something invisible. A low, almost imperceptible sound escaped his throat, not a growl, but a warning hum. The old man followed Ranger's gaze, his expression shifting subtly, as though a memory had stirred where it did not belong. For an instant, the rain seemed to fade. The smell of jet fuel blended with something older, heavier, smoke, metal, shouting voices carried by wind that did not exist anymore. Ranger's body pressed closer, just as he had years ago in places no one here could imagine. The moment passed. "Sir," Martin snapped, irritation creeping into his tone. "I'm asking you to leave. Now." The old man straightened, drawing on a discipline that had once been demanded of him under far crueler skies. With careful deliberation, he reached into the inner pocket of his soaked jacket and pulled out a phone. Older model, scuffed, practical. His hands no longer trembled. He raised it to his ear. "Daniel," he said quietly, clearly. "Connect me. Now." Martin scoffed. "Whoever you're calling, it won't change anything." The old man did not respond. His gaze returned to the glass doors, reflecting his own image back at him. An aging man, soaked, standing on borrowed ground, judged by appearances that told none of his story. Ranger stood unwavering at his side, eyes still watchful, as if he too understood that some lines, once crossed, could never be uncrossed. Inside the lounge, laughter continued. Outside, the rain showed no sign of mercy. And somewhere between those two worlds stood a man the world had forgotten, not because he was unworthy, but because remembering him would have required gratitude. If this story moved your heart even a little, remember that God often works through moments of injustice to reveal unseen truth. Like, share, comment your thoughts below, and subscribe to Angels in Uniform, so together we can honor those whom miracles once protected and whom the world must never forget. Morning always came earlier for him than it did for most people. Not because he had anywhere to be or anyone waiting, but because his body no longer understood the luxury of sleeping in. Before the sun fully rose, before the city outside his small apartment began to stir, Colonel Samuel Whittaker was already awake, sitting on the edge of his narrow bed, breathing slowly as if negotiating with the day before, agreeing to face it. The room was modest, almost bare, furnished with only what was necessary. A wooden chair with a folded jacket draped over it, a low table by the window, and a neatly made bed that bore no sign of restlessness. Years of discipline had left their mark even here, in a life stripped of ceremony. Ranger lay on the floor beside him, alert despite the early hour. The German shepherd's body was large and powerful, his black and tan coat catching the faint gray light filtering through the blinds. Though aging, Ranger's movements were still purposeful. He lifted his head the moment Samuel shifted, dark eyes watching closely, reading the familiar signs. Ranger had learned long ago that mornings were the hardest. He did not rush forward. He waited, patient and steady, tail resting against the floor like a quiet promise. Samuel reached for the prosthetic leg leaning against the wall. The metal was cool to the touch, heavier than it looked, and he handled it with the practiced care of someone who had done this thousands of times. He did not resent it. Resentment required energy, and he had learned to conserve what little remained. Fitting the prosthetic was a slow ritual. Aligning the socket, tightening the straps, testing the balance with a cautious shift of weight. A faint tightening crossed his face, not quite a grimace, but close. Pain, like memory, was something he carried rather than confronted. Ranger stood then, stepping close, his shoulder brushing Samuel's thigh. The dog's presence was not sentimental. It was functional, instinctive, forged by years of shared survival. When Samuel finally rose, standing tall despite the slight imbalance, Ranger adjusted with him, matching his pace, his body positioned just enough to steady him if needed. Together, they moved toward the window, where Samuel paused, gazing out at the quiet street below. There was a time when mornings had meant purpose. Briefings, orders, faces turned toward him, waiting for decisions that carried weight. He had once been called sir by men who trusted him with their lives, by voices that carried respect without needing to be asked for it. Now, mornings were silent. No one called, no one waited, and no one asked what he had done before the world decided he was done. Later that day, after the rain from the night before had faded into low clouds, Samuel and Ranger ventured out. The city moved around them, indifferent and efficient. People passed without slowing, their eyes sliding over him in that practiced way, polite, distant, dismissive. To them, he was a man with a limp and a dog, a reminder of fragility, something uncomfortable, a problem best not acknowledged. No one wondered why he walked the way he did, or why the dog stayed so close. No one wondered what it had cost. At the airport cafe near the terminal, Samuel sat at a small table while Ranger lay at his feet. A young couple nearby whispered to each other, glancing briefly at the dog before returning to their phones. An older man stared openly at Samuel's prosthetic, curiosity untempered by shame. Samuel did not react. He had learned that silence often satisfied people more than explanation ever could. Ranger shifted suddenly, lifting his head. His ears twitched, and he stared across the room at a television mounted high on the wall. The screen showed a news segment, grainy footage of soldiers overseas, moving through dust and debris. The volume was low, barely audible over the hum of conversation. But Ranger's focus sharpened. His body stiffened, muscles coiled, as if waiting for a command that would never come. Samuel followed his gaze, and for a moment, the cafe faded. The smell of burnt metal returned without warning. The memory was sharp and unwelcome. Men shouting orders, the sound of rotor blades cutting through smoke. He blinked, grounding himself, his hand instinctively resting on Ranger's head. The dog exhaled slowly, easing back down, but his eyes remained fixed on the screen until the image changed. That was the thing about being forgotten. The world moved on easily. It forgot names, faces, sacrifices. It remembered uniforms only when they were clean and new, when the stories were convenient and the endings tidy. It did not remember the men who came home changed, incomplete, quieter than before. A woman passed their table and hesitated. She was middle-aged, her hair pulled back into a loose bun, her face lined with fatigue and kindness in equal measure. She glanced at Ranger, then at Samuel. "Service dog?" she asked softly. "Yes," Samuel replied. She nodded, offered a brief, uncertain smile, and moved on. That was all. No further questions. No thank you. No acknowledgement. Just another moment that passed without landing. As the afternoon wore on, Samuel felt the familiar ache building in his leg. He rose carefully, Ranger immediately at his side, and made his way toward the terminal exit. Outside, the clouds hung low, threatening rain again. Samuel paused beneath the overhang, watching people hurry past, burdened by schedules and destinations that no longer applied to him. He wondered, not for the first time, when he had stopped being seen as someone who mattered. It hadn't happened all at once. It never did. It was a gradual erosion, 1,000 small dismissals that added up to invisibility. No parade marked the transition. No announcement declared his usefulness expired. It simply happened, quietly, like rust forming beneath paint. Ranger pressed closer, sensing the shift in his mood. Samuel rested, his hand on the dog's neck, drawing comfort from the steady rise and fall beneath his palm. Ranger did not ask questions. He did not require explanations. He did not need Samuel to prove who he had been. To Ranger, he was enough, just as he was. That night, back in the apartment, Samuel sat in the dim light, his prosthetic removed and resting against the wall. Ranger lay nearby, head on his paws, eyes half closed but attentive. Samuel stared at the dog tags in his hand, their edges worn smooth by time and touch. Names were etched into them, his own, and others who would never grow old enough to be forgotten. He closed his fist around them and let the silence settle. He did not fear pain. Pain had been a companion for too long to inspire fear. What he feared, quietly, deeply, was something far worse. He feared becoming a man who had lived, fought, and sacrificed, only to be treated as if he had never existed at all. If this chapter stirred your spirit, remember that God sees those the world overlooks, and no sacrifice escapes his notice. Like, share, comment your thoughts, and subscribe to Angels in Uniform so together we can honor the unseen miracles carried by those who served. They let him in because the rain grew louder, not because their minds grew softer. The glass doors slid open with a muted sigh, and warm air spilled out to meet him, carrying the scent of coffee and polished wood. Colonel Samuel Whitaker crossed the threshold slowly, careful with his footing as the wet sole of his left shoe met marble. The prosthetic resisted for a fraction of a second before settling, a familiar hesitation that sent a dull ache up his leg. Ranger entered beside him, head level, posture alert, his wet coat darkening the rug where they stood. No one welcomed them. No one offered a towel. The decision had already been framed as temporary, conditional, reversible. Martin Hale watched from behind the reception desk, arms folded neatly across his tailored jacket. He did not look relieved that the situation outside had ended. He looked vigilant. His eyes tracked Samuel's movements with a professional suspicion sharpened by habit. Years earlier, Martin had built his sense of worth around control of space, of rules, of who belonged where. It was a quiet power, rarely challenged, and he protected it fiercely. When Samuel took 2 steps toward the seating area, Martin leaned toward a young attendant and spoke softly, though not softly enough. "Keep an eye on him." The attendant was a man in his early 30s, pale, clean-cut, hair cropped close to his scalp. His name badge read, Evan Price. He nodded without asking questions, his mouth tightening as if compliance were easier than thought. He took up a position near the seating area, pretending to organize magazines while his gaze flicked repeatedly toward Samuel and Ranger. Samuel felt it immediately. The shift in the room's attention. Not the open stares of curiosity he had grown used to, but something colder and more deliberate. The kind of watching that reduced a person to a potential problem. He chose a chair near the corner, one that allowed his back to rest while keeping his left leg extended just enough to ease the pressure. Ranger lay down at his feet, ears erect, body angled outward, creating a quiet boundary. Around them, the lounge hummed with low conversation. Business travelers sat with laptops open, fingers tapping, voices murmuring. A woman with perfectly styled blonde hair laughed softly at something on her phone. An elderly couple shared a newspaper, their heads bent close together. On the surface, it was a room full of decent people. Well-dressed, polite, orderly. Yet not one of them acknowledged the man who had been forced to stand outside moments earlier. Comfort, Samuel thought, had a way of dulling courage. Ranger's ears twitched sharply when Evan stopped near them. The dog lifted his head, eyes fixed, body tense. Evan froze, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Easy there," he muttered, more to reassure himself than the dog. Ranger did not growl. He did not move. He simply stared, unblinking, until Evan stepped back. Samuel rested, a hand on Ranger's neck, feeling the steady warmth beneath damp fur. "It's all right," he murmured, though he was no longer certain whom he was comforting. A few seats away sat a man in his late 60s, broad-shouldered despite his age, with a thick mustache graying at the edges and hands that bore the faint scars of manual labor. His posture was stiff, almost formal, even as he leaned back in his chair. He wore a plain jacket over a collared shirt, nothing remarkable at first glance. But when Samuel shifted, adjusting his balance with practiced care, the man's eyes narrowed slightly. Something about the movement, the economy of it, the restraint, pulled at a memory he had not visited in years. The man's name was Frank Delgado, though no one here knew it. He had served once, long ago, before life carried him elsewhere. He told himself he was imagining things, that the resemblance meant nothing. Still, he watched Samuel's face, the calm set of his jaw, the way his eyes remained alert without being restless. Recognition hovered at the edge of his thoughts, uncomfortable and uncertain. Frank looked down at his hands, then back up. He did nothing. The silence pressed in, not heavy but pervasive. Samuel felt it as clearly as he felt the ache in his leg. This was not the roar of hostility. It was the hum of indifference, the sound of people choosing ease over empathy. He wondered how many of them considered themselves kind. How many would speak passionately about fairness in safer settings. Ranger shifted again, standing suddenly. His ears stood fully erect, and he placed himself directly in front of Samuel, blocking the line of sight from the desk. The movement drew attention, brief glances, raised eyebrows. Martin straightened, irritation flaring. "Sir," he called out, his tone tight. "Please keep your dog under control." Ranger remained still, eyes locked on Martin. There was something uncanny in the dog's focus, as if he were measuring not threat, but intent. Samuel met Martin's gaze steadily. "He is under control." A pause followed. The room seemed to hold its breath. Then Ranger did something unexpected. He turned his head away from Martin and looked upward, toward the high ceiling where soft lights glowed behind frosted panels. His body relaxed slightly, but his gaze remained fixed, attentive, as if listening for something beyond human hearing. Samuel felt a strange stillness settle over him, the kind he remembered from moments just before dawn, in places where survival depended on faith as much as training. He could not explain it, only feel it, a sense that unseen lines were being drawn. The moment passed as quietly as it had arrived. Ranger lay back down, resting his chin on his paws. Frank's heart thudded. That look, that discipline, that silent exchange, was not something you mistook once you had seen it in the field. His mouth went dry. He opened it, then closed it again. What if he was wrong? What if he embarrassed himself? The room seemed suddenly hostile, not to Samuel, but to the truth Frank felt pressing against his ribs. He looked away, choosing uncertainty over action. Minutes stretched. Samuel closed his eyes briefly, breathing through the discomfort in his leg. He did not need pity. He did not need applause. He needed rest, dignity, and the simple acknowledgement of his humanity. None of those were being offered freely. From the desk, Martin continued to watch, satisfied that order had been restored. Evan resumed his pacing, careful to keep a respectful distance from the dog. Around them, conversations resumed, laughter returned, and the lounge reclaimed its illusion of harmony. Samuel opened his eyes and looked around once more. He saw nothing hostile in the faces around him, only absence. And in that absence, he recognized a truth more painful than any insult spoken aloud. Evil, he had learned, rarely announced itself with fury. More often, it relied on silence, on good people deciding it was not their place, on comfort outweighing conscience. Ranger lifted his head again, meeting Samuel's gaze. For a fleeting moment, Samuel felt seen, not by the room, but by something deeper, steadier. He placed his hand on the dog's head, grounding himself in that certainty. If this chapter stirred something in your heart, remember that God's justice often moves quietly before it moves boldly. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to Angels in Uniform, so together we can witness the miracles that begin when silence is finally broken. The decision was made quietly, the way most cruel decisions are. Not announced, not debated, simply enforced. Martin Hale didn't raise his voice when he informed Samuel that he would need to leave the lounge area. His tone was professional, almost courteous, as if he were doing the old man a favor by allowing him a shred of dignity on the way out. "We'll escort you to the general waiting area," he said, already gesturing toward the exit. "That will be more appropriate." Samuel rose slowly from the chair, bracing himself as his left leg protested. The prosthetic felt heavier than it had an hour ago, as if it were absorbing every unspoken insult and pressing them back into his body. Ranger stood immediately, stepping close, shoulder aligned with Samuel's thigh, his presence firm and deliberate. Around them, conversations paused for just a moment, then resumed. No one objected. No one asked why. They were led through a side corridor and out toward the tarmac, where the rain had returned in full force. The open space swallowed sound, leaving only the roar of engines in the distance and the relentless drumming of water against concrete. A sleek private jet waited ahead, its white body gleaming under harsh floodlights, stairs lowered like a promise meant for someone else. Samuel felt a tightening in his chest. Not desire, not entitlement, but exhaustion. He had stood, waited, endured. He had followed every instruction given to him. And still, it was not enough. A new figure stepped forward near the base of the stairs, blocking their path. She was a woman in her late 30s, tall and angular, with sharp cheekbones and hair pulled back into a severe bun that emphasized her pale complexion. Her uniform was immaculate, pressed to perfection, and her posture radiated authority earned through repetition rather than compassion. Her name badge read Elaine Porter, though she did not introduce herself. Her eyes flicked over Samuel with open appraisal, pausing briefly on the prosthetic before returning to his face. "This aircraft is reserved," she said crisply. "I'll need to see confirmation that you're authorized to board." Samuel reached into his jacket, movements careful, deliberate. Before he could speak, Elaine raised a hand. "Before that," she added, "may I ask what your occupation is, sir?" The question struck harder than she intended, or perhaps exactly as hard. Samuel hesitated. Occupation implied relevance, purpose, a place in the present tense. He met her gaze, steady but tired. "I'm retired." Elaine's lips pressed into a thin line. "And before that?" Silence stretched. Rain slid down Samuel's collar, cold against his skin. "Does it matter?" he asked quietly. Elaine's eyes hardened. "It does when determining eligibility. These flights are costly. Are you certain you can afford this?" The words landed like a slap. Not loud, not dramatic. Public. Final. Behind Elaine, a ground crew member shifted uncomfortably. He was a stocky man with a shaved head and a short beard, perhaps in his early 40s, wearing a reflective vest dulled by years of use. His name was Tom Reeves, and his eyes betrayed a flicker of shame. He looked from Samuel to Ranger, and then away, choosing the safety of silence. "I've already been cleared," Samuel said, his voice even though something inside him began to fracture. Elaine shook her head. "Until I see proof, I'll need you to step aside. You can wait in the public seating area inside the terminal." The rain intensified, driven sideways by a sudden gust of wind. Samuel shifted his weight, the slick surface beneath his left foot causing the prosthetic to slide unexpectedly. His balance faltered. For a split second, the world tilted. Ranger reacted instantly. He surged forward, placing his body squarely in front of Samuel, bracing him with a firm nudge that kept him upright. The dog's ears were fully erect now, eyes locked on Elaine, his stance unmistakably protective. A low, controlled sound vibrated in his chest. Not a growl, but a warning drawn from instinct and loyalty. "Control your animal," Elaine snapped, stepping back. "If that dog becomes aggressive, I'll call animal control." The threat hung in the air, heavier than the rain. Ranger did not move. He did not bare his teeth. He simply stood his ground, body a living shield between Samuel and the world that seemed determined to push him down. Samuel felt something shift within him then, not anger, not rage, but a profound, aching clarity. This was not about a seat on a plane. It was not about money or access or rules. It was about being reduced to a problem, a suspicion, an inconvenience to be managed. He had endured insults before, endured pain that would have broken lesser men. But this public stripping of dignity, cut deeper. Elaine raised her phone, thumb hovering. "Last warning," she said. In that moment, Samuel looked around. He saw Tom's rigid posture, his eyes fixed on the ground. He saw a pair of passengers watching from a distance, curiosity outweighing concern. He saw the jet looming behind them, silent and indifferent. And he understood, with devastating certainty, that silence had become the weapon of choice. Ranger pressed closer, his body warm and solid against Samuel's leg. The dog's breathing was steady, grounding. Samuel placed a hand on Ranger's head, fingers sinking into wet fur, and felt something like resolve settle over him. He straightened despite the pain, despite the rain. "No," he said softly. Elaine blinked. "Excuse me?" "I will not move," Samuel continued. His voice did not rise. It did not tremble. "And you will not take him." For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Elaine's face. She had expected compliance. Apologies. Retreat. Not resistance delivered so quietly. It left no room for escalation. The rain continued to fall, unrelenting, washing over, the scene as if to bear witness. Samuel stood there, an old man with a prosthetic leg and a service dog, facing down a system that had decided he was expendable. He did not know what would happen next. He only knew that he had reached the limit of what he could endure in silence. When dignity is pressed against a wall, silence itself becomes a crime. If this moment stirred something in your spirit, remember that God's miracles often begin where human cruelty believes it has won. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to angels in uniform. So together, we can stand witness to justice that rises even in the rain. The rain did not stop when Samuel said no. It fell harder, if anything, streaking the tarmac in silver lines that reflected the harsh lights above. Elaine Porter stood frozen for a moment, her phone still raised, thumb hovering as if the authority she relied on had suddenly become uncertain. Around them, the small circle of witnesses tightened and loosened in subtle shifts. Feet adjusting, shoulders turning away, eyes flickering with unease. Silence thickened, not empty, but strained. That silence broke with a voice that did not belong there. "I'm sorry." It came from behind Samuel, soft but clear. A young woman stepped forward from the edge of the terminal doors, rain spotting the shoulders of her uniform. Her name badge read Lily Brooks. She was in her early 20s, slender, with light brown hair pulled back into a simple ponytail that revealed a pale face flushed with nerves. Her eyes were wide, earnest, and trembling. Not with fear alone, but with resolve that had finally outweighed it. Lily swallowed hard before continuing. "I'm sorry for how you've been treated, sir. This isn't right." Elaine turned sharply. "Lily," she snapped, "this does not concern you. Go back inside." Lily didn't move. Her hands shook at her sides, but she lifted her chin. "It concerns all of us," she said quietly. "He hasn't done anything wrong." Elaine's jaw tightened. "You're stepping out of line. Do you understand that what you're doing could cost you your position?" Lily's lips pressed together. For a split second, doubt flickered across her face. The kind that came from imagining rent unpaid, phone calls unanswered, a future suddenly uncertain. Then she looked at Samuel, at the water dripping from his jacket, at Ranger standing firm despite the threat hovering over him. "I understand," she replied, "but I won't pretend I didn't see what happened." Samuel turned toward her, surprised. He saw the fear there, raw and unpolished, and beneath it, something rarer. Conviction, unshielded by experience. He stepped slightly forward, placing himself between Lily and Elaine without raising his voice. "She spoke out of kindness," he said. "If there's a problem, it's with me." Elaine scoffed. "That's not how accountability works." Samuel met her gaze, steady despite the ache radiating through his leg. "Then perhaps that's the problem." Ranger shifted, placing his body closer to Lily now, an unconscious extension of his protective instinct. The dog's presence seemed to anchor her, and Lily exhaled slowly, grounding herself in that silent support. A few steps away, Tom Reeves watched the exchange unfold, his brow furrowed beneath the brim of his rain-speckled cap. His beard was peppered with gray, his shoulders broad from years of physical labor. He clenched his fists, jaw working as if chewing on words he did not dare speak. His gaze drifted past Samuel and landed on another figure, standing just beyond the floodlights. Frank Delgado had not left. The older man stood near a service vehicle, rain darkening the shoulders of his plain jacket. His mustache was damp, his lined face pale beneath the glow. He had tried to walk away earlier. He truly had. But something about the scene, the quiet defiance, the dog's stance, the way Samuel held himself even when pressed, had followed him like a weight. Now, watching Lily risk everything for a stranger, something inside him finally gave way. Frank's hands trembled as he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He stared at the screen for a long moment, rain blurring his vision. Memories surged unbidden, sand and heat, voices barking orders, a man standing in front of him during a briefing decades ago, calm in the face of chaos. Frank's breath hitched. "It can't be," he whispered. And yet, he knew. He dialed. The phone rang twice before a voice answered, firm, seasoned, unmistakably military. Frank turned slightly away, lowering his head as if in prayer. "Sir," he said, his voice shaking despite himself. I think you need to know something. I'm at the airport. There's a man here, an older man, with a service dog, and I believe..." He swallowed. "I believe he's one of ours." Back on the tarmac, Elaine's patience thinned. "This situation is escalating," she said coldly. "I'm contacting security." Samuel felt the moment tightening, narrowing towards something inevitable. He reached into his jacket once more, fingers brushing the familiar shape of his phone. When he lifted it, his hand was steady. He did not look at Elaine when he spoke. "Internal security," he said into the receiver. "I'm requesting immediate review of all camera footage from the lounge and the tarmac. From the last 2 hours. Elaine's eyes widened a fraction. "You can't do that." "I just did," Samuel replied. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then Ranger did something no one expected. He lifted his head and looked skyward again, ears pricked, body still. His gaze followed something unseen, and for a moment, the rain seemed to soften around them, its roar fading into a distant hush. Lily felt it first, a warmth spreading through her chest, unearned and inexplicable. Tom felt it next, his fists unclenching without conscious thought. Even Elaine hesitated, unsettled by a sensation she could not name. Samuel closed his eyes briefly. In that stillness, he felt a presence he had not acknowledged in years, not commanding, not judging, but patient, as if someone, somewhere, had decided that enough was enough. The moment passed as suddenly as it came. Engines roared in the distance. The rain resumed its relentless pace. But something had shifted. The balance, once tilted so heavily against him, no longer felt immovable. Elaine lowered her phone slowly, her certainty eroding. "This isn't over," she said, though the words lacked their former weight. Samuel looked at her, not with triumph, but with quiet resolve. "No," he agreed. "It's just beginning." Lily let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Frank ended his call, staring at his phone as if it had just rewritten his understanding of the world. Tom Reeves finally lifted his head, shame and relief warring in his eyes. The truth did not shout. It did not demand attention. It simply waited for someone brave enough to turn on the light. If this chapter touched your heart, remember that God often uses ordinary people to reveal extraordinary truth. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to Angels in Uniform. And witness how even the smallest act of courage can become a miracle. The rain softened just enough to let the sound of approaching engines carry across the tarmac. It was not the roar of aircraft this time, but something lower, heavier, deliberate. Headlights cut through the gray curtain of mist, moving in formation toward the terminal. Those who had remained, Elaine Porter, stiff-backed and pale, Tom Reeves, rooted in place, Lily Brooks, trembling but resolute, Frank Delgado, clutching his phone as if it might slip from his grasp, turned instinctively toward the sound. Colonel Samuel Whitaker did not turn. He stood where he was, Ranger pressed firmly at his left side, hand resting on the dog's head. His posture was calm, disciplined, as though he had been standing at attention for years and simply never stopped. The ache in his leg was sharp now, insistent, but he ignored it. Pain had never been the thing that defined him. The vehicle stopped several yards away. Doors opened in unison. Men stepped out, uniformed, deliberate, unmistakable. At the center was a tall man in his early 50s, broad-shouldered, his dark hair trimmed close, streaked with gray at the temples. His face was angular, jaw set beneath a neatly kept beard that framed a mouth accustomed to issuing orders. His uniform was immaculate, medals catching what little light remained. This was Colonel Matthew Reyes, a commanding officer whose reputation was built not on volume, but on certainty. Those who served under him said he spoke rarely, but when he did, it mattered. Reyes's eyes scanned the scene quickly, professionally, until they landed on Samuel. Something in his expression changed. Not surprise, not confusion, but recognition layered with reverence. He stepped forward, boots striking the wet ground with controlled precision. The air around them seemed to still. "Colonel Samuel Whitaker," Reyes said, his voice steady and unmistakably respectful. "United States Navy SEALs. Retired." The name cut through the space like a blade of light. Frank Delgado sucked in a sharp breath, his knees nearly buckling. Lily's hand flew to her mouth. Tom Reeves stared, eyes wide, as if the world had suddenly shifted sideways. Elaine's face drained of color, the certainty she had clung to collapsing in silence. Samuel closed his eyes briefly. He had not heard his full name spoken like that, complete, unhesitating, honored, in years. When he opened them again, he met Reyes's gaze with quiet composure. "That's correct," he said simply. Reyes took another step forward and stopped. Slowly, deliberately, he came to attention. The sound of his boots clicking together echoed across the tarmac. Then he raised his hand in a crisp salute. Every uniformed man behind him followed suit. The gesture was not ceremonial. It was not for show. It was instinctive, earned. Elaine's mouth opened, then closed. Words failed her. She had asked him what he did for a living. She had asked if he could afford to be there. The absurdity of it struck her like a physical blow. Reyes lowered his hand and spoke again. "Sir," he said. The word weighted with meaning. "You are the man who stayed behind when extraction failed. The man who carried 3 wounded teammates through enemy fire when the rest of the unit had been ordered out." The rain seemed to quiet as he spoke. "You are the one who held the line," Reyes continued, his voice unwavering. "Who refused evacuation until every man under your command was accounted for. You lost your leg ensuring others kept theirs. You saved lives that night, Colonel. Many of them." Images flickered across Samuel's mind. Faces blurred by smoke and blood. Ranger's predecessor barking in the chaos, the sharp pain that came later after the mission was over. He did not speak. He did not need to. Ranger lifted his head, ears relaxed for the first time that day. His tail moved once, slow and dignified, as if he too understood what was being acknowledged. Elaine staggered back a step. Her authority, so carefully constructed, had evaporated. She looked at Samuel, then at Reyes, then at the ground. There were no procedures left to hide behind. I didn't know," she whispered. Reyes's gaze flicked to her briefly, cool and assessing. "That," he said evenly, "is the problem." A hush settled over the onlookers. Lily felt tears sting her eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming rightness of the moment. Frank Delgado bowed his head, shame and relief crashing together in his chest. He had known. Somewhere deep down, he had known. And he would carry the weight of his silence for the rest of his life. Reyes turned back to Samuel. "We're here now," he said quietly, "and we won't be leaving you standing." Samuel exhaled, a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The tension in his shoulders eased slightly. He looked down at Ranger, fingers brushing the familiar scar on the dog's ear. "Took you long enough," he murmured, a trace of dry humor breaking through. Reyes allowed himself a small smile. "You were never forgotten," he replied, "only misplaced." Around them, the truth settled into place. Not shouted, not forced, simply undeniable. Some people do not need to be celebrated. They do not seek recognition or praise. But forgetting them, forgetting what they gave, is an injustice no society can afford to excuse. If this chapter moved your spirit, remember that God calls every sacrifice by name, even when the world forgets. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to Angels in Uniform, and witness how faith, truth, and courage converge into miracles. The sound arrived before the sight. A low, synchronized rumble rolled across the tarmac, steady and deliberate, cutting through the thinning rain like a distant drumbeat. One by one, black military vehicles emerged from the gray horizon, headlights aligned, spacing precise. They did not rush. They did not hesitate. They moved with the confidence of an institution that knew exactly why it had been summoned. For the first time since the ordeal began, the air itself seemed to shift. From uncertainty to inevitability, Colonel Samuel Whitaker remained where he stood. His posture was unchanged, shoulders square despite the ache radiating from his left leg, rainwater still clinging to the hem of his jacket. Ranger stood pressed against him, the German shepherd's broad head level, eyes alert but calm now, as if sensing that the danger had passed and something greater was about to unfold. The dog's coat was still wet, his scarred ear twitching occasionally, but his breathing was slow and even, grounded in trust. The lead vehicle stopped several yards away. Doors opened in near-perfect unison. Uniformed soldiers stepped out, men and women of varying ages, faces composed, movements economical. Their boots struck the wet ground in clean, measured sounds. At their center was Colonel Matthew Reyes, his presence unmistakable. The rain no longer mattered. Every eye on the tarmac followed him. Reyes took 3 steps forward, then stopped. He looked at Samuel, not as an official assessing a situation, not as a superior asserting command, but as one soldier recognizing another. Reyes came to attention. The sound echoed, sharp, absolute. His heels clicked together, his back straightened, his chin lifted. Then his hand rose in a flawless salute. Behind him, every soldier followed. The gesture unfolded like a wave, spreading outward in silence. No commands were given. None were needed. The line of uniformed figures stood rigid, saluting an old man with a prosthetic leg and a service dog, rainwater pooling around their boots. It was not ceremony. It was reverence. Elaine Porter felt the weight of the moment crush the last of her resistance. Her rigid posture collapsed inward, shoulders slumping, eyes fixed on the ground. She had enforced rules her entire career, believing order was the same as justice. Now she understood how wrong she had been. Tom Reeves removed his cap and held it against his chest, his beard trembling as he swallowed hard. Lily Brooks stood frozen, tears streaking her face unchecked, overwhelmed not by sorrow, but by something purer. Validation that her courage had mattered. Frank Delgado stepped forward instinctively, his weathered hand rising into an imperfect but heartfelt salute of his own. His eyes glistened. He had been silent too long, but he was not silent now. Reyes lowered his hand and took a single step closer to Samuel. His voice, when he spoke, carried no theatrics, only truth. "Sir," he said, every syllable weighted with respect, "we apologize for arriving late." Samuel studied the man before him. He saw the discipline etched into Reyes's bearing, the quiet responsibility in his eyes. He saw an officer who understood that timing mattered, not just in battle, but in justice. Slowly, Samuel shook his head. "I don't need an apology," he said. His voice was calm, steady, carrying across the silent tarmac. "I only want to make sure no one else ever has to stand out here like this. Not forgotten, not doubted, not alone." Reyes nodded once. "That will be done." The next moments unfolded without drama, but with finality. 2 officials from airport administration approached Elaine. Their faces were grave, their voices low. Papers were signed. Badges were removed. Elaine did not protest. She bowed her head and stepped back, her authority gone, replaced by something she had not expected to feel: shame. Others who had participated in the humiliation followed suit, eyes averted, movements small. The system that had empowered them had now exposed them. As the last of the paperwork was completed, something remarkable happened. The rain stopped, not gradually, not politely. It simply ceased, as if the sky itself had decided its witness was complete. Clouds thinned, and a pale wash of light broke through, illuminating the tarmac in soft gold. Water dripped from the edge of the jet's wing in slow, rhythmic drops. Ranger shifted, stepping closer to Samuel. The dog lowered his head and pressed it gently against the prosthetic leg, resting there as if sealing a vow. Samuel's hand came down instinctively, fingers spreading across Ranger's damp fur. He closed his eyes for a moment, breathing in the quiet. For the first time in a long while, he felt seen, not as a problem, not as a relic, but as a man whose life had mattered. Reyes stepped aside, gesturing toward the aircraft. "Whenever you're ready, sir." Samuel opened his eyes and nodded. He took one careful step forward, then another, Ranger moving in perfect sync at his side. The soldiers remained at attention until he passed, their salutes unwavering. No applause followed. None was needed. As Samuel reached the base of the stairs, he paused and looked back. His gaze swept across the gathered faces. Lily's tearful resolve, Frank's bowed head, Tom's quiet remorse, the soldier's standing guard. He spoke one final time. His words meant not just for those present, but for anyone who might hear the story later. "If today were you," he said, voice firm but gentle, "would you stand up? If this story touched your heart, remember that God's justice may arrive late, but it never arrives by accident. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to Angels in Uniform, and help spread the miracles born when courage meets faith. Sometimes, miracles do not arrive with thunder or fire from the sky. Sometimes, they arrive quietly, standing in the rain beside someone the world has forgotten. God does not always remove suffering at the moment it begins, but He never ignores it. He watches. He remembers. And when the time is right, He moves through people, through courage, through truth, through one voice that refuses to stay silent. In our daily lives, we may not face soldiers or uniforms, but we face moments of choice every day. Moments where we can look away or stand up. Moments where we can stay silent or speak for someone who no longer has the strength to speak for themselves. Faith is not only what we believe in church, it is what we do when no one is watching. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to share it with someone who may need hope today. Leave a comment and tell us what this story made you feel, or share a moment when you saw kindness change a life. Subscribe to Angels in Uniform so we can continue honoring those who served, those who sacrificed, and the quiet miracles that still happen among us. May God bless you, protect you, and guide your heart. May He give you the courage to stand when it matters, and the compassion to see those the world too often overlooks. Amen.